While shopping at a new local bakery for Thanksgiving, the woman starts trembling when she sees the bracelet the attendant was wearing, the same one she gave her daughter 25 years ago when she was forced by her millionaire parents to give up her baby for adoption. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Stay tuned until the end, things are about to get intense. Now, let's get into it. Elena Carter traced the rim of her teacup with her finger as she gazed out the window, watching the pale sunlight filter through the bare branches of the maple trees. The quiet of the morning was comforting, the kind of silence that enveloped her modest home with a sense of calm. It was a small house, nestled at the edge of town, its kitchen filled with mismatched dishes and walls lined with framed photos of friends who had become family over the years. Life hadn't always been this simple. Elena had grown up in a world of grandeur, a sprawling estate marked by elegant parties, crystal chandeliers, and the suffocating expectations of her wealthy parents. But those years felt like another lifetime now. She'd long since traded high society for a life she could call her own, built on quiet moments and authentic connections, not on appearances and the weight of family legacy. Thanksgiving was only a day away, and Elena's excitement simmered as she mentally went over the preparations. The holiday had become a cherished tradition among her friends, a celebration of gratitude and togetherness. She could already picture it, the table spread with dishes brought by her closest friends, Margot bringing her famous cranberry sauce and James contributing his spiced apple cider. This year, Elena wanted to add something special to the mix, a fresh pecan pie from a local bakery she'd been meaning to visit. It was the kind of place she loved, cozy, with warm lights and the promise of good stories exchanged over pastries. The idea of visiting Lila's hearth filled her with an unexpected flutter, the anticipation of something new mingled with the nostalgia that always settled around her this time of year. Elena stood and stretched, brushing her hands over her worn flannel shirt. As she reached for her coat, a familiar pang of sorrow gripped her heart. It was subtle, like the ghost of a bruise, but it was always there. She glanced at the old photo she kept tucked in the kitchen drawer, out of sight but never out of mind. It was of her at 28, cradling a tiny infant bundled in a yellow blanket. The last time she saw her daughter, she'd pressed a silver bracelet into the baby's delicate wrist, a token of love she hoped would bridge the distance that soon separated them. 25 years had passed since that day, but the memory was as vivid as ever. The decision hadn't been hers. It was made in the sterile confines of her parents' study, their voices cool and resolute as they insisted she give up the child to preserve the family's reputation. The scandal of an unwed mother wasn't a blemish they would tolerate. The ultimatum was simple: give up the baby or lose everything, including the thin thread of security her family provided. Elena chose her daughter, if only in the heartrending way she could at the time. The adoption was arranged swiftly, leaving her with a hollow ache and a life that would never be the same. Shortly after, she left the estate behind and never looked back, rebuilding her life on her own terms. But the absence of her child was a silence that spoke louder than any noise, especially during the holidays. She closed the drawer with a sigh, the past retreating as she focused on the day ahead. Thanksgiving was about love and gratitude, and she owed it to herself and her chosen family to be fully present. The aroma of pumpkin bread she'd baked earlier lingered in the air, mixing with the faint scent of pine from the garland draped over the kitchen archway. The scene was a patchwork of contentment, but somewhere in that peace was a yearning she didn't allow herself to voice. Elena pressed the back of her hand to her lips, catching a surprised laugh as it escaped. She had just bumped into a stack of tiny pumpkins at the local market, their bright orange color a playful contrast to the crisp, late November sky. She gathered her composure, tucking a stray lock of auburn hair behind her ear. At 53, life had a way of wrapping small moments in nostalgia, and today was no different. She felt the warmth of familiarity in the chill of the morning air and in the bustle of people making final Thanksgiving preparations. For Elena, Thanksgiving was more than a holiday, it was a time when she gathered her found family, those who had stood by her when her blood ties had failed. Her modest home at the edge of town would soon be filled with their laughter, stories, and the scents of cinnamon and roasted squash. The image made her heart swell. After years of walking through the shadows of loss, she had learned to savor the light. Elena Carter stepped into Lila's hearth, and the world seemed to shift around her, warmth replacing the crisp November chill outside. The bakery was a haven of life and comfort, its golden lights reflecting off the dark wood-paneled walls. An array of baked goods stretched across the glass display cases, each one a small masterpiece: glazed apple tarts, perfectly browned loaves, and pecan pies topped with intricate latticework. The place hummed with the gentle murmur of conversation, the hiss of the espresso machine, and the occasional clink of spoons against mugs. The holiday season had cast its glow, adding an extra layer of anticipation to the air. Elena felt a smile tug at her lips as she took in the scene. A small child pointed at a basket of cranberry scones, eyes wide with excitement, while an older couple shared a laugh at a table by the window. The sense of belonging in this place was palpable, and Elena let herself bask in it, if only for a moment. She moved toward the end of the line, letting her eyes wander over the shelves stocked with jars of preserves and wrapped loaves tied with twine. Her gaze drifted behind the counter, where a young woman with dark, curly hair moved with practiced ease, sliding fresh pastries onto a tray. Elena's heart did a little flutter at the warmth in the girl's smile as she exchanged words with a customer. The girl shifted to place the tray in the display case, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. The sleeve of her soft blue sweater slipped down her arm, revealing a thin, silver bracelet with a heart-shaped charm that swung as she worked. Elena's vision blurred, and her breath caught in her throat. It was a small, familiar glint, but it struck her like a lightning bolt. No, it couldn't be. It was impossible, and yet there it was, the bracelet she had clasped around her infant daughter's wrist the day she said goodbye. The room spun as the weight of memories crashed over her, a wave of grief, hope, and disbelief all tangled together. She reached for the edge of the nearest table, her fingers grasping at the polished wood to keep from collapsing. "Elena? Are you okay?" A middle-aged woman in line next to her, clutching a box of cookies, glanced at her with concern. "I'm fine," Elena whispered, though her voice was distant, as if coming from somewhere else. She nodded absently, eyes fixed on the young woman behind the counter. The girl, blissfully unaware of the turmoil she had just ignited, laughed at something a coworker said, the sound clear and light. Elena's knees trembled, and she felt a rush of heat, followed by an icy chill. She needed air, needed to steady herself before she fell apart. Pulling back from the line, she made her way to a small corner of the bakery where a chair sat next to a shelf of cookbooks. The noise of the room receded as her heartbeat thudded in her ears. The past she had locked away for so many years now surged forward, each memory vivid and raw. The sterile room where she'd said goodbye, the soft coo of her baby wrapped in a yellow blanket, and the bracelet she had fastened with shaking hands, all of it came flooding back. She pressed a hand to her chest, trying to catch her breath, trying to hold herself together. As she sat there, eyes closed and fighting the wave of emotion, the young woman moved between tables, carrying a tray of warm pastries and greeting customers with a smile that lit up her face. The bracelet shimmered in the soft light, each sway a reminder that the impossible might not be so impossible after all. Elena sat in the small chair, the hum of the bakery muffled by the noise of her own thoughts. The sight of that bracelet had stirred something deep and unyielding within her, something that years of moving forward hadn't dimmed. She took a shaky breath, pressing her fingers into her palms to steady herself. A gentle voice broke through her turmoil. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Elena's eyes shot up, locking with the warm, hazel eyes of the young woman who now stood in front of her, tray balanced on one hand. Up close, she saw that the girl had a small freckle just below her left eye and a dimple that appeared as she spoke. For a moment, Elena couldn't find her voice. It was as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. Yes, I'm fine, she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. It was a reflex, an automatic shield. But her hands betrayed her, trembling slightly as she reached for her purse, if only to have something to do. Are you sure? The young woman's brow furrowed, a hint of concern softening her features. You look a bit pale. Elena's heart thudded, but she forced a smile. I just got a little lightheaded. The holiday rush, you know. She tried to sound casual, but the sound of her own voice felt foreign. The girl nodded, her expression easing into a smile. It does get a little crazy, doesn't it? Especially here, it seems everyone in town needs their pie fix for Thanksgiving. She shifted the tray and glanced at Elena's hands, then back to her face, as if checking to see if she was really okay. I'm Lila, by the way. Lila. The name hit Elena with a strange familiarity that made her breath catch. She swallowed, her throat dry. Nice to meet you, Lila. I'm Elena. Lila shifted her weight, the charm on her bracelet catching the light as it moved. Elena couldn't help but stare, her gaze tracing the delicate heart shape, the way it nestled against Lila's wrist like it belonged there. It was like seeing a ghost from her past, except this ghost had eyes that sparkled with life and laughter. That's a lovely bracelet, Elena said, the words slipping out before she could second-guess them. Her voice was soft, careful, as if any sudden movement might shatter the moment. Lila looked down at her wrist, her smile turning nostalgic. Thank you. I've had it as long as I can remember. The orphanage where I grew up told me it was a gift from my birth mother. She said it lightly, but there was a touch of wonder in her tone, as if she were sharing something precious. The air thickened between them, filled with unspoken words that crowded Elena's mind. She blinked rapidly, willing the tears to stay put. She couldn't break down here, not now. Lila watched her with a curious expression, head tilted slightly, waiting for a response that didn't come. Elena forced herself to nod, keeping her voice steady. That's beautiful. It must mean a lot to you. It does, Lila said, her dimple appearing as she smiled again. I don't know anything about my birth mother, but sometimes I like to think this bracelet is a piece of her, a reminder that she thought about me. Her words were simple, but they struck Elena with the force of a wave, the longing in them mirroring her own. For a brief moment, silence settled between them, heavy with unacknowledged truths. Lila glanced at the bustling bakery behind her and then back at Elena. Well, if you need anything else or need to sit a bit longer, just let me know, okay? Thank you, Lila, Elena managed, her voice almost a whisper. I'll be all right. Lila nodded, giving her a final, reassuring look before moving back behind the counter. Elena's eyes followed her, watching the easy way she laughed with a coworker, the familiar tilt of her head. The reality of what just happened slowly seeped in, leaving Elena breathless. She rose to her feet, her fingers brushing against the pie box she had placed on the chair beside her. The weight of it was oddly grounding, a reminder that she was still standing, still capable of moving forward. She walked back to the counter, feeling Lila's presence even when she turned away to help another customer. Can I help you with anything else? Lila's voice was bright as she returned her attention to Elena. No, just the pecan pie, Elena said, gripping the edges of the box tighter than necessary. She needed to leave, to process what she had just learned. Thank you. Of course. Have a happy Thanksgiving, Lila said, her smile unwavering. Elena nodded, her own smile tight as she turned and made her way out of the bakery. The bell chimed overhead as she stepped into the cool November air, but she barely registered it. Her mind was already racing with possibilities, questions that buzzed like electricity. The bracelet, the orphanage, the stories untold, it was too much to process, but one thing was clear, she needed to know more. Elena walked down the sidewalk, the pie box clutched to her chest like an anchor. The world around her blurred, filled with the promise and fear of what she might uncover. Elena Carter sat at her kitchen table, the steam from her untouched tea curling into the cold air. The silence was thick, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the house settling. The pecan pie she'd bought from Lila's hearth sat in the center of the table, forgotten amidst the storm of her thoughts. She reached for her phone, hesitating before tapping the screen. It was late, and part of her felt foolish, but she couldn't bear to wait another day. The call connected, and Margot's voice, warm and familiar, came through. "Elena? Everything okay?" Elena's voice trembled, surprising even herself. "Margot, I need your help. It's about the adoption." There was a pause, long enough for Elena to imagine Margot's brows knitting together with concern. "I'm on my way. Put the kettle on." Elena hung up, exhaling as if she'd been holding her breath for hours. She moved through the motions of making fresh tea, her hands shaking slightly as she filled the pot. Before long, headlights swept across the window, and Margot's familiar figure, bundled in a wool coat, appeared on the porch. She stepped inside, bringing a rush of cold air and her comforting presence. "Elena, what happened?" Margot asked, her eyes scanning her friend's face. "It's Lila," Elena said, barely above a whisper. "The girl at the bakery. She's wearing the bracelet, Margot." "The bracelet?" Margot's eyes widened, and she pulled a chair out, sitting close to Elena. "Are you sure?" "I would know it anywhere," Elena said, a tear escaping despite her best efforts. She mentioned it was a gift from her birth mother. "I need to know if it's her, Margot. I need to know if she's my daughter." Margot placed a steadying hand over Elena's. "Then we'll find out. Let's start with the records. I'll help you." The next morning, Elena's determination was sharper than the November wind that rattled the windows. She spent hours calling every adoption agency and orphanage in the area, explaining as much as she could without breaking into tears. Some calls led to dead ends, others to long holds and sympathetic voices that promised to look into it. Margot stayed with her, offering quiet support, making tea and sandwiches that Elena barely touched. By evening, they were exhausted, a stack of scribbled notes and agency numbers scattered across the table like pieces of an unfinished puzzle. Then, one call changed everything. "Elena, this is Grace from Willow Grove Orphanage," the voice said. "I believe I may have some information. Would you be able to come in tomorrow morning?" Elena's hand tightened around the phone, the world tilting under the weight of the moment. "Yes, I'll be there." The following day, Margot drove Elena to the orphanage, the familiar streets blurring past as Elena's thoughts raced. The building was old, with ivy climbing up the brick and frost edging the windows. Inside, it smelled of lemon polish and old wood, a mix of warmth and history. Grace, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, greeted them in her office. She gestured to a chair, her expression both gentle and guarded. "Thank you for coming," she said, folding her hands on her desk. "We keep meticulous records, and when I heard your story, I took a closer look. There was a baby girl adopted out around the time you mentioned, given a bracelet with a heart charm." Elena's heart clenched. "What do you know about her now?" "She was named Lila by her adoptive parents," Grace said, a small smile breaking across her face. "She grew up nearby, and when she was old enough, she came here to ask about her origins. We told her what we could, which, unfortunately, wasn't much." Margot reached for Elena's hand, squeezing it as if to keep her from floating away. Elena swallowed hard, her voice shaking. "Lila, she's at a bakery now. I saw her, spoke with her. But I didn't know what to do. I still don't." Grace's eyes softened. "Sometimes, the best first step is simply reaching out. You don't have to have all the answers yet." The drive home was quiet, punctuated only by the rustle of the wind and the rhythmic thud of the tires against the road. Memories began to surface, unbidden. The imposing study in her parents' home, where her mother's voice rang cold and final. You will give her up, Elena. There is no discussion. The helplessness that followed, the weight of being young and trapped, and the small act of love, the bracelet, that was all she could give her daughter as she was taken away. Margot broke the silence. Elena, you don't have to do this alone. When you're ready, I'll go with you to the bakery. Elena nodded, grateful for the steadfast support. That night, she replayed Lila's voice in her head, the casual way she spoke about the bracelet, and the hope in her eyes when she mentioned her unknown mother. The ache in Elena's chest felt less like pain and more like anticipation, fragile but alive. She reached for the phone and dialed Margot, her voice steadier this time. Tomorrow. Let's go back to Lila's hearth. Margot's answer came without hesitation. We'll be there. Elena set the phone down, a small, hopeful smile breaking through the tension. It was time to take that first step. Elena Carter stood outside Lila's hearth, her breath visible in the crisp November morning. The air was sharp and filled with the faint, sweet notes of cinnamon drifting from inside the bakery. She clenched and unclenched her fingers, willing herself to step forward, to walk through the door and face the possibility that had kept her awake all night. The path that had once seemed impossible now lay before her, marked by small, tentative steps. The bell above the door chimed as she walked in, the warmth wrapping around her like a blanket. The bakery was as alive as ever, bustling with people and the hum of conversation. Elena's eyes immediately sought out Lila, who was moving with her usual grace behind the counter, filling coffee cups and passing out bags of pastries. When their eyes met, Lila's face lit up with recognition. Hi, Elena. Lila called out, stepping toward her with a bright smile. Back for more pie? Elena's heart softened at the greeting. I might be. But mostly, I just wanted to say hello, she said, trying to sound casual, though her voice quivered ever so slightly. Lila's smile widened, her dimple appearing. That's sweet. It's nice to see a familiar face. She glanced at the clock on the wall. Actually, we're gearing up for something special. Tomorrow, we're hosting our annual Thanksgiving community event. We serve meals to those who don't have a place to go. Would you like to come? It's a bit hectic, but always fun. The question caught Elena off guard. Her initial instinct was to hesitate, to protect herself from stepping into something that felt so vulnerable. But there was something in Lila's eyes, an openness that pushed her to nod. I'd love that, Elena replied, a warmth blooming in her chest. Great. Lila said, her enthusiasm genuine. Come early if you can. We always need extra hands to help set up. Elena left the bakery with the invitation clutched tightly in her mind, the scent of baked apples following her out. The air felt different now, charged with a mix of anticipation and nervous energy. Tomorrow wasn't just a holiday, it was a chance to find a piece of herself she'd lost long ago. The next morning, Elena arrived early, her heart pounding as she stepped inside Lila's hearth. The space was transformed, tables covered in bright cloths and platters ready to be filled with warm dishes. Volunteers moved around, laughter and chatter filling the room. Lila, wearing an apron dusted with flour, waved her over. You made it. Lila beamed, handing Elena a spoon and gesturing to a bowl of mashed potatoes. Think you can help with this? Elena chuckled, feeling lighter than she had in days. I think I can manage. They worked side by side, scooping generous portions onto plates and passing them along the line. The room filled with the sound of gratitude, murmurs of thank you, and the delighted squeals of children sampling pumpkin pie. Elena found herself glancing at Lila when she thought she wasn't looking, taking in the way she laughed, the way she moved with such joy. There were fragments of herself in the girl's gestures, tiny reflections that both comforted and pierced her. At one point, as the line began to slow, Lila leaned against the counter and took a sip of water. I love this event, she said, eyes scanning the room. It's like, for one day, everyone's family. Elena nodded, the sentiment hitting home. It's beautiful. And you're wonderful for doing this. Lila shrugged, a playful smile teasing her lips. I guess I just wanted to create something I wished I'd had when I was little. She paused, eyes growing more reflective. Growing up in the orphanage, Thanksgiving was one of the loneliest days. Most of the kids got sad around the holidays, you know? It made me determined that, someday, I'd build my own traditions. Elena's chest tightened, each word adding weight to the silent story she carried. You never knew your birth parents? She asked, her voice tentative, almost afraid of the answer. Lila shook her head. No. I used to dream about them, though. Wonder who they were, if they thought about me. The bracelet was my only clue, but I learned to stop wishing too hard. She glanced at the silver chain on her wrist, the tiny heart catching the light. Elena swallowed the lump in her throat, willing herself not to cry. The mix of guilt and longing surged so powerfully that it felt like it might break her. I'm sure they thought about you, she said, her voice almost breaking. Every single day. Lila's eyes flickered with curiosity, and for a moment, the air between them shifted, a silent question forming but left unspoken as someone called Lila's name. Duty calls, Lila said with a grin, excusing herself to tend to the next batch of volunteers. Elena watched her move away, a bittersweet ache settling in her heart. The room around her pulsed with laughter and warmth, but it all felt muted compared to the thundering truth inside her. She had come this far, and now she knew, she couldn't let it rest. Lila's kindness, the gentle way she spoke about her past, it deserved the truth, even if the path to it was uncertain. Elena turned back to the table, hands working mechanically as she served the next guest. Tomorrow, or maybe even later today, she would find the right moment to tell Lila. It wouldn't be easy, but some stories, no matter how long they stayed hidden, were meant to be told. The soft glow of the early evening sun cast a warm light through the windows of Lila's hearth. The clamor of the community event had subsided, leaving behind a cozy quiet punctuated by the clinking of dishes and the low hum of conversation between the last remaining volunteers. Elena stood by the counter, wiping her hands on a cloth as she watched Lila stack chairs with easy grace. The day had been a whirlwind, filled with laughter and small moments that made Elena's heart ache in the best way. Mind if I sit for a moment? Elena asked, motioning to the stool across from Lila. Lila smiled and nodded. Of course. You've earned it. They sat in a comfortable silence for a moment, the bakery settling around them. Elena's gaze drifted to the bracelet on Lila's wrist. It had been there all day, a silent reminder that tied past to present, a secret only Elena knew. She took a steadying breath and reached out. That bracelet is so lovely, Elena said, her voice gentle. I noticed it before. May I ask where you got it? Lila's eyes softened as she turned her wrist to examine the charm. This? It's pretty special to me, she said, a wistful note in her tone. The staff at the orphanage told me it was given to me when I was a baby. They said it came from my birth mother, who left it as a sort of keepsake. Elena's throat tightened, and she nodded, trying to keep her expression neutral even as her pulse quickened. That must have meant a lot, to have something of hers. It did, Lila admitted, her fingers absently tracing the delicate heart. It was all I had. Growing up, I'd imagine her wearing it or picking it out just for me. It made me feel like maybe, somewhere out there, she loved me. The weight of those words settled heavily between them. Elena's vision blurred as tears welled up, her heart hammering with everything she had never been able to say. Before she could stop herself, the truth tumbled out. I was that woman, Elena whispered, the words breaking like a wave she could no longer hold back. Lila's smile faltered, eyes widening as the confession hung in the air between them. Silence fell, thick and trembling. What did you just say? Lila's voice was barely above a whisper, but the disbelief was clear. Elena's tears spilled over, unstoppable now. I gave you that bracelet, she said, the memory sharp and vivid in her mind. I was young, and my parents, they forced me to give you up. But I loved you, Lila. I never stopped. Lila stood, the stool scraping against the floor as she pushed back. Her expression shifted from shock to something more guarded, a mix of confusion and hurt. She took a step back, then another, as if needing to put space between them. No, that can't be right, Lila stammered, eyes darting between Elena's face and the bracelet. You're saying you're her voice broke, and she shook her head as though trying to clear it. Why now? Why tell me this now? Elena reached out but let her hand drop when she saw Lila's guarded posture. I didn't know until recently, she said, trying to steady her voice. I saw the bracelet, and I had to know for sure. I'm so sorry for dropping this on you, but it's true. Tears filled Lila's eyes, but she blinked them away, her expression hardening. I need some air, she said, turning abruptly and heading toward the back door of the bakery. Elena stood frozen, the cold absence of Lila's warmth pressing against her. The quiet room, once so welcoming, now felt like an empty shell. She wanted to chase after Lila, to say all the things she'd rehearsed in her mind for decades, but her legs wouldn't move. All she could do was stand there, silent tears carving paths down her cheeks as the door swung shut. The sound of distant chatter from the street seeped in, and Elena sank into the stool, cradling her face in her hands. The truth was out, but it felt less like relief and more like a wound that had finally been exposed to the cold air. The stillness was broken only by the faint sound of a clock ticking in the background, each second a painful reminder that some things, once spoken, could not be taken back. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains in Lila's hearth, casting soft patterns across the wooden floor. The bakery was closed for the holiday, and the stillness in the room mirrored the tension that hung in the air. Elena sat at one of the small, round tables, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She hadn't slept, replaying every word from the day before in her mind, questioning and second-guessing herself into exhaustion. The sound of the door opening made her look up. Lila stood in the entryway, her face set with determination but her eyes cautious. She took a breath and walked over, sitting down across from Elena without a word. The silence stretched between them until Lila finally spoke, her voice low. Tell me everything, she said, eyes searching Elena's face for answers she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. Elena nodded, the weight of decades pressing on her chest. I was young, barely 23, when I found out I was pregnant, she began, her voice trembling but steady. At first, I thought my parents would support me, that they'd help me find a way to raise you. But they were different people, Lila. They cared about reputation more than family. Her fingers twisted together as she spoke, each memory a painful cut. They gave me an ultimatum, give you up or lose everything. Lila's expression softened, but she remained silent, letting Elena continue. I couldn't fight them, Elena admitted, her eyes brimming with tears. They arranged the adoption. It all happened so quickly. I only had a moment to hold you, to press this bracelet into your tiny wrist. It was the only piece of me I could leave with you. And then, you were gone. A tear slipped down Lila's cheek, and she quickly brushed it away. And you never tried to find me? Elena's voice caught, and she took a shaky breath before continuing. I did, at first. But the adoption was closed, and my parents' influence ran deep. They made sure I couldn't reach you, and by the time I broke away from them, it felt like too much time had passed. I thought you'd have a new life, maybe a better one, and I didn't want to disrupt that. She hesitated, then reached into her purse and pulled out a faded photo. But not a day went by that I didn't think of you. The picture was old and worn, showing a young Elena holding a newborn bundled in a soft blanket. The baby's tiny wrist gleamed with the same heart-shaped bracelet that now circled Lila's wrist. Lila stared at the photo, her eyes wide with recognition. Slowly, she pulled out her phone and swiped through her pictures until she found what she was looking for. She turned the screen to face Elena. The image was one the orphanage staff had given her, a baby wrapped in a yellow blanket, with a close-up of the bracelet. Elena's breath caught, a sob rising in her chest. The two images were mirror reflections, separated only by time and heartbreak. She looked up to find Lila watching her, tears streaming silently down her face. "It's you," Lila whispered, her voice cracking as the truth settled over her like a long-awaited sunrise. "It's really you." They moved at the same moment, standing and stepping into an embrace that was decades in the making. The hug was fierce, raw with the pain of lost time and the joy of connection. Tears fell freely, soaking into shoulders and hair, but neither pulled away. "I'm so sorry, Lila," Elena said, her voice muffled. "For everything. For not being there, for the years you grew up without knowing." Lila pulled back just enough to look at her, a soft smile breaking through the tears. "I'm here now. We're here now." Elena nodded, relief washing over her as they sat back down, hands still clasped tightly. The silence was different now, no longer heavy but full of unspoken promises. Lila wiped her face, her smile brightening with a touch of mischief. "So, what are your plans for today?" Elena chuckled through her tears, warmth spreading through her. "I was supposed to have a Thanksgiving dinner with my friends. I'd love it if you'd come with me." Lila's smile widened, and she nodded. "I'd like that." The sun was setting when they arrived at Elena's house. Margot was the first to greet them at the door, her eyes widening when she saw Lila. Elena quickly explained, her voice shaky with emotion, and Margot's smile turned radiant. "Well, it's about time," she said, pulling both women into a hug. James, with his booming laughter and easy charm, soon joined in, and before long, the house was filled with warmth, stories, and the scent of Thanksgiving dinner. Lila sat at the table, surrounded by strangers who felt like family. Elena watched her, heart full to the brim as Lila shared a laugh with James and exchanged stories with Margot. The past and present blended seamlessly, turning the bittersweet ache of lost years into the promise of new beginnings. As dessert was served and conversation turned to future plans, Elena leaned over and squeezed Lila's hand. "Next year, we can host Thanksgiving together. Make it our tradition." Lila's eyes shone with gratitude. "I'd like that, Mom." The word wrapped around Elena's heart, healing parts of her she didn't even know were still broken. The future stretched before them, wide and bright, with the promise of more laughter, more stories, and a bond that had finally found its way home. The air outside Lila's hearth carried the crispness of early November, a hint of frost promising the start of the holiday season. Inside, the bakery hummed with anticipation. Flour dusted the counters, and trays of pies cooled on racks, their sweet scents blending with the gentle chatter of early morning customers. Lila stood by the window, looking out at the familiar street, her heart full as she sipped her coffee. Elena approached, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Thinking about tomorrow?" she asked with a knowing smile. Lila nodded, eyes bright with excitement. "I can't wait. Hosting this Thanksgiving brunch feels like everything we talked about last year is coming to life. A way to make sure no one feels alone on a day meant for togetherness." Elena's chest swelled with pride. "You're turning this place into more than a bakery, Lila. It's become a home for so many." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small card she'd written the night before, ink smudged from her fingers. "I wanted you to have this." Lila unfolded the card and read, her smile softening as her eyes skimmed the words, "For all the Thanksgivings we missed and all the ones we have to come. Love, Mom." She glanced up, blinking back tears, and wrapped her arms around Elena. The next morning, the bakery buzzed with volunteers and the clink of plates. Lila's adoptive parents, Peter and Nora, had flown in from out of state and were busy setting up a table filled with warm drinks. They moved with an easy grace, smiles never leaving their faces as they arranged trays of cookies and baskets of bread. When they saw Elena walk in, Peter's smile widened. He reached out a hand, his voice rich with warmth. "Elena, it's so good to see you again." Nora stepped forward, wrapping Elena in a hug. "You know, we can't thank you enough for finding us all those months ago and sharing your story with us. It brought us closer as a family." Elena's eyes misted. "Thank you for welcoming me. I didn't know what to expect, but this is more than I ever hoped for." Lila, watching from behind the counter, felt a deep sense of peace. The scene before her was exactly what she had always wished for but never knew was possible: her adoptive parents laughing alongside her birth mother, friends like Margot and James bustling about with trays, and new faces filtering in, drawn by the warmth of an open invitation. As the brunch began, the bakery filled with people. Some were neighbors who had been coming for years, others newcomers who had heard about the community event and wanted to be part of it. The room buzzed with stories, the clatter of forks, and the soft hum of holiday music playing in the background. Elena and Lila moved together through the crowd, pausing to chat and share smiles with the guests. At one point, Elena found herself standing next to Nora, watching Lila laugh as she handed a cup of cider to a wide-eyed child. Nora leaned closer, her voice low but warm. "We're lucky, aren't we? To have her in our lives." Elena nodded, her heart full. "More than I can say." Margot appeared then, cheeks flushed and hair slightly out of place from helping in the kitchen. "Ladies, you need to try James' spiced apple pie before he eats it all himself," she said with a grin, waving them over to the dessert table. They gathered around, cutting slices of pie and exchanging stories of old holidays and new traditions. Lila's adoptive parents shared tales of Thanksgivings filled with road trips and mismatched plates, while Elena spoke of quiet evenings with friends who filled the silence of what she'd lost. And now, here they all were, piecing together a future where laughter came easily, and love was at the center. When the afternoon began to wind down and the last of the guests waved their goodbyes, Lila stood on a chair, catching the attention of those who remained. "Thank you all for being here today. This is just the first of many Thanksgiving brunches at Lila's hearth, and I hope it becomes a tradition we share year after year." Applause filled the room, and someone shouted, "To many more." Elena met Lila's eyes from across the room, a proud, quiet smile passing between them. In that moment, it was clear, this was not just a day marked by old griefs and empty spaces. It was a beginning, a new chapter filled with traditions they would shape together. As the last rays of sunlight streamed through the bakery window, Lila made her way over to her mom, slipping her arm around Elena's waist. "Ready for next year?" she teased, a playful glint in her eyes. Elena laughed, the sound light and free. "More than ready," she said, squeezing Lila's hand. For the first time in years, the future felt boundless, filled with the promise of more stories, more shared meals, and a family that, against all odds, had found its way back to each other. Elena stood at her kitchen counter, the rhythmic tapping of rain against the window adding to the unease in her chest. The letter she held had arrived in an envelope too thick to be anything but significant. It was from a law firm she recognized, one that had represented her parents' estate for years. She tore it open with steady hands, but as she read, her fingers tightened on the paper. Her parents had passed away. The news was sudden, a jolt that brought with it a tangle of emotions. Their wealth, so bound up in the life she'd left behind, now came back to her in a way she never expected. What surprised her even more was the mention of Lila. Her parents had left a substantial share of their fortune to the granddaughter they had never met. Elena sank into a chair, the letter fluttering onto the table. Guilt, surprise, and a bittersweet sadness vied for space in her heart. The same people who had torn her from her daughter were now, years too late, reaching out with a gesture meant to bridge a lifetime of distance. The door creaked, and Lila stepped into the kitchen, shaking raindrops from her coat. "Hey, Mom," she said, smiling as she set down a bag of groceries. Her smile faltered when she saw the look on Elena's face. "What's wrong?" Elena gestured to the letter, her voice tight. "I need to tell you something." Later, they sat side by side at the dining table, the legal documents spread between them. Lila's brow was furrowed as she read, her fingers tracing the embossed letterhead. There was a pause before she spoke, a mix of surprise and sadness in her voice. "They left me part of their estate?" Elena nodded, her throat constricting. "Yes. And there's more." She pushed a smaller, yellowed envelope toward Lila. "I found this with the papers." The envelope bore her mother's handwriting, and Elena hesitated before unfolding the letter. She began to read aloud, the words filling the room with the ghosts of old regrets. "Dear Elena and Lila, we don't deserve forgiveness, but we hope these words find you and bring some understanding. The day we forced you to make that decision, we thought we were protecting our family, but instead, we destroyed it. We kept tabs on Lila over the years, quietly helping where we could, ensuring she had opportunities and a safe place to grow. It was never enough, but it was all we could think to do. Our only wish now is that the wealth we amassed, which means so little without family, can be used for good. Please, take what we have given and use it to heal, to build, to bring joy to others as we failed to bring to you both. With love. Your mother and father." The room was silent as Elena's voice trailed off. She set the letter down, her eyes glistening. Lila looked at her, a mix of emotions playing across her face, shock, compassion, and a deep understanding. "They followed my life?" Lila said, the question more to herself than to anyone else. She took a deep breath, then reached for Elena's hand. "This is a lot." "It is," Elena agreed. "But we don't have to rush into decisions. We can take our time." Lila squeezed her mother's hand. "No, I think I know what we should do." A few weeks later, Lila's hearth buzzed with activity. The bakery had been expanded, with an airy new space attached that housed a small meeting room and a cozy area filled with books and toys for children. Lila stood next to Elena, watching as the first visitors, mothers with young children, a few teenagers shyly stepping in, filled the space. They had decided to use the inheritance not just for the bakery but to create a foundation that supported young mothers and adoption programs. A place that offered resources, comfort, and a sense of belonging. The bakery, once only a place for pastries and warmth, now extended that feeling to those who needed it most. Peter and Nora, Lila's adoptive parents, walked in, their faces lighting up as they took in the scene. Margot and James followed, laden with baskets of baked goods and wide smiles. "I think your parents would be proud of this," Margot said to Elena, nudging her gently. "And so should you." Elena's smile was soft, full of gratitude. "It feels right," she said, turning to Lila. "It feels like we're turning what was lost into something beautiful." Lila nodded, her eyes reflecting the strength they both shared. "It's a new chapter for all of us." As the first official event began, Elena found herself next to Lila, who was reading to a group of children, her voice animated and filled with warmth. The room buzzed with laughter, hope, and the kind of love that hadn't come easily but had finally found its way home. The bakery wasn't just a place filled with the scent of cinnamon and freshly baked bread, it was a place where stories were shared, where new traditions were forged, and where the bonds of family, old and new, were celebrated. And for Elena, that was more than enough.